Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. I am Barry Slaughter Olsen, and I am a professor of interpreting and translation at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies in Monterey, California. Also a conference interpreter, and it is my privilege and honor to be able to moderate this panel on 100 years of interpreting practice. And I have four distinguished panelists that are joining me, beginning on my far right, a man who needs no introduction, Jesus Baigorri Jalón, who is a retired associate professor from the Translation and Interpreting Department at the University of Salamanca, and has a PhD in geography, history, and translation studies. He's also a retired UN staff interpreter and multi-time author on the history of our profession. And so, Jesus, thank you for joining us today. To his left, we have Juan Jimenez Marin, who was born and raised actually in Germany to Spanish parents, and studied interpreting in Barcelona, later in Geneva, and then began with the European Parliament in 1988. Where he continues to this time. He was the head of the German interpretation unit and a freelance recruiter, and is currently the director of interpreter planning and support. He's also the chair of the YAMLAP, and I think this is probably one group that understands what that acronym means. And he is the chair of the working group on training. And he's also a member of HINTS, which is a network of chief interpreters around the globe. And it's just good to have Juan Carlos here. He will be representing the institutional side of things when we talk about the history of interpreting practice. Juan Carlos, welcome. Then to his left is Matthew Ball, who is a graduate of the University of Ottawa and has an MA in conference interpreting and lexicography. That's quite a combination right there. And he is currently the Director of Interpretation and Chief Interpreter of the Translation Bureau of the Government of Canada. He's also done some teaching at the University of Ottawa and was appointed to his current position this year in 2019. A little bit of information, since I'm thrilled that we have the head of one of the National Interpreting Services here to talk with us today. They provide over 10,000 interpreter days a year, everything from what goes on at Parliament Hill there in Ottawa, all the way to international delegations and official missions around the globe. And they provide interpreting, obviously, in the official languages of Canada, English and French, but also signed, Indigenous, and many other languages as well. And Matthew is also a member of HINTS. And then to my direct right, I have to find my cards here. I'm using technology from the 20th century, and very happily so. Uros Peterc, who is the president of UNIGE, and so I'm a little nervous because I'm standing next to the president of my professional association. That's true, sitting. See, I don't even know if I'm sitting or standing. Born in Yugoslavia, a country that no longer exists, he attended schools in English, French, German, and Slovenian in Poland, Austria, and the United States. He's been a professional conference interpreter for 23 years and has been a freelancer that entire time. So also a wonderful perspective for us to have as we look back on on interpreting practice over the last 100 years. He's an accredited interpreter for the European Union in 7 different languages, and it was in January 2018 that he was elected president of UNIGE at the Valencia General Assembly. And so this is our distinguished panel. So if you'd like, please give him a round of applause, and we're going to get started. So in preparation for this panel, we took a look at that 100 years. Gratefully, they gave us a century to look at and to reflect back on. We know that interpreting goes back much farther than that. And we have areas of expertise with these 4 gentlemen. But I want to start out with a couple of questions that will get us reflecting. And I'd like you to think about these as well. We had an amazing quote that came at the end of the keynote. And I'm going to do a free translation of this quote from Jesus. And he said, "A profession that does not understand its past has no future." And what I would like to do is ask each of you, what do you think that means? And what does that mean for us as we're reflecting back on 100 years? What is it that we need to know about our past? Everybody's thinking, oh no, I hope he doesn't ask me first. So, Jesus, you were the one that had the comment, so let's start with you.
Hello? Is it on?
Yes.
Well, I think I have explained during about 3/4 of an hour why I think history is important. So, I mean, you have quoted me, and I'm glad that you did. A past for a future is what I was intending to show here. And yes, I think if we don't know where we come from, we can hardly know where we are going to. I mean, this is basically the idea. It may sound like, you know, like a riddle or something, but that's the kind of thing I wish to endorse. I mean, the fact that if we don't reflect on what our predecessors did, is the sound gone? We can hardly place ourselves where we are now. And the story, for instance, of Aik is very telling about all the battles that have been fought in order to obtain better working conditions, the ergonomic booths and the sound quality and so on and so forth. Many of the technical innovations have brought about controversy in the profession or in the pre-profession, because I have gone back to the proto-professional period, I would say. So this is why I think it is important to reflect on the past. And this is what basically every profession does. I mean, there is a subject in, when you study medicine, there is a subject entitled History of Medicine. There is a subject in law, which is the history of law. If you don't know what happened in the past, you cannot know where you are.
Yeah.
Now, that is the idea.
Just as a quick follow-up question to that, Jesus. So it was in 1919 at the Paris Peace Conference that, you know, the big three got together. You had Wilson, you had Clemenceau, and you had Lloyd George, who were all hashing out what those languages were going to be, and the preference was that it was going to be French. But Woodrow Wilson put forth that proposal to include English and French, and I remember reading about this and saying that not to undermine whatsoever the importance of Italian, but that French and English would be enough. Do you think that as they were hashing those things out, that they had given any thought to what that would mean in practical terms when they finally said, okay, it will be French and English?
Well, the thing is that Orlando was also there, and Orlando didn't, he spoke Italian and French. Wilson didn't speak French, he spoke only English. Lloyd George wasn't that good in French in his secondary school. He spoke Welsh, though. And Clemenceau spoke very good English. He was married to an American, and he spoke very good English. They could have understood, the three of them, among them, without any problem. Orlando was, so to say, the weak link. And that is why they had to provide the connection with French. Plus, there is all the story about French being the diplomatic language for the past or the previous centuries. Wilson was a heavyweight character there, and he insisted on the fact that English had to be used. It wasn't the first time that English had been used and imposed as imposed is a way to speak, imposed as an official language. In fact, the empire of the United States came about after the war against Spain, and the negotiations that took place in 1898 in Paris as well happened to be interpreted by an American interpreter, Ferguson, because the Spanish delegation thought the American counterparts were going to speak French, which was the diplomatic language. They didn't, but they went with their own interpreter. So my fellow Spaniards were in the hands of the enemy's interpreter, so to say. He was quite faithful, apparently, and no problem was caused by his activity, but still. So the thing is that they decided to use the two languages because of that. And they provided, or they had at hand, Paul Mantoux, who was bilingual in French. He was a French professor of history, but he had been also in the army. He wore the captain uniform. He had been in the army during the war, and he had been in the Interlight Commissions working as an interpreter. So he had a background of interpreting, plus he knew a lot of the topics because he was a professor of history in Britain, of French history in Britain, when he was brought to interpret in Paris. So he sort of had all the conditions that allowed him and enabled him to be a good interpreter. But I mean, the need was because they couldn't understand among the four of them.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, Orlando had one of the diplomats, Aldrovandi, used to play the role of an interpreter for Orlando outside the meetings, of the four. More informal meetings.
And after those meetings of the four, how did they transition to the institutions with the ILO and with the League of Nations to be able to start providing an organized service in those meetings?
Well, I think they carried out competitive exams, public competitive exams, and they were recruited mostly. I would say that the sociological background of the two sections, the French and the English, basically British, because remember that the United States didn't join after the Senate, didn't approve the treaty. So the United States didn't join the League of Nations. But I mean, the British section was mostly made up of people who came from the Foreign Service and the Military Colonial Administration, whereas the French section was mostly from the academic side, people from, professors, or teachers of languages, and so on. It was a very small staff manning table at that time, and manning is the right word because they were only males.
And interestingly enough, I see that we've ended up with an all-male panel here today. I will say in the defense of getting this set up that I am a pinch hitter for someone who was not able to attend, who was a woman, of course. But interesting to note that when they all began, it was a lot of men, and then slowly it started to transition. When you got to the Nuremberg trials after the Second World War. But before we jump to that, we had the League of Nations, you had the tests that took place of simultaneous interpretation, first at the League of Nations and later at the ILO. And then in the interim, Second World War broke out, and that was it for the equipment. It kind of sat for a while and then was dusted off. The idea came from Leon Dostert that they would find some way to be able to provide speedy justice, and that was the issue. It was one of speed and being able to make sure that the trial did not go on forever. And so here again, I think that speaks to some of the things that we heard during the Pechacucha session about what were the needs of the clients at that time. And when you go back and look at how that was put together, it was quite significant when they had to say the time issue was of the essence. There needs to be a way to have a trial that isn't going to go on forever with those multiple languages. And so let's transition a little bit now to what took place after the Second World War. And we can talk a little bit more about the Nuremberg trials, but I'd like to go to Juan Carlos and just ask him about the importance of the first European Commission. It takes place in 1958 and has led largely, those were the initial steps that have led to the European Union as we know it today, and a regime of multilingualism. And so tell us a little bit about that, about 1958 and that crucial period.
May I put myself into the hands of the
Most definitely.
enemy interpreters and speak in Spanish?
Por favor, adelante.
Bueno, pues yo creo que el proyecto europeo que nació en los años 50, sin duda alguna, es un proyecto emocionante, a pesar de que algunos actualmente quieran abandonarlo o no lo tengan muy claro. Pero creo que efectivamente ha sido un proyecto que todavía continúa y que para la profesión ha sido muy importante, porque no solamente todas las lenguas de los Estados miembros están representadas, sino que además les está dando voz a muchas lenguas que no son lenguas tradicionalmente de conferencia. O sea, si pensamos, por ejemplo, que empezaron con francés, holandés, alemán e italiano, el holandés, sin duda alguna, no era precisamente una gran lengua de conferencia en los años 50. Hoy en día estamos incluso interpretando a partir del irlandés, maltés. O sea que yo creo que ha sido verdaderamente algo que no solamente desde el punto de vista político, histórico, que sin duda alguna es muy importante y que es lo más importante probablemente de ese proyecto, sino también desde el punto de vista de nuestra profesión, ha sido una revolución. En estos momentos en las instituciones europeas trabajamos con 24 lenguas oficiales. Eso significa 552 combinaciones lingüísticas. No me puedo imaginar cómo haríamos si no se hubiera dado el salto de la consecutiva a la simultánea. No me lo puedo imaginar cómo lo haríamos. Con lo cual, efectivamente, es una muestra muy clara de que nuestra profesión es vital, como lo ha sido a lo largo de la historia, para crear puentes, para contribuir a la paz y al entendimiento entre todos.
Thank you so much for that. And I think this is actually a good time to transition to Matthew. And what we've seen with multilateralism is, and I definitely take your point, I cannot fathom how to have a regime with 24 official languages working in consecutive and still be able to be efficient in getting things done. And from a multilateral standpoint, it's a huge thing that needs to take place. But from, let's say, within one country, right? In the case of Canada, which does have an official, multilingualism is an official policy of the Canadian government, and I believe it was the Official Languages Act of '69, if I get my year right. Matthew, so what has that meant in practical terms for the service that you are in charge of? And how has that evolved over the years since, again, the idea of saying we're going to be multilingual, we're going to give these languages equal weight is all fine and good when you're looking at it in theory and you put it into a law. But when, as they say, when the rubber hits the road, things tend to change significantly. So what has your experience been, and what has the experience of Canada been?
So, can you hear me? Yeah. So, you hit the nail on the head, Barry. Most people, when they think of official languages in Canada, think of 1969. But in fact, it goes back much beyond that. It goes right back to the beginning of the country with the Constitution Act in 1867, where French and English were both allowed and promoted in the Parliament. But it was a much more symbolic equality of the languages back then. The reality is that over the years, Francophone members of parliament were often left aside in the debate, or they had to speak English very well in order to be understood and to convey any sophisticated or nuanced messages. And in the political discourse, that was a real challenge. So while they were allowed to speak and use French and English in the parliament, in reality, French was not used very much. And already in 1952, members of parliament saw what was happening elsewhere in the world and saw the provision of simultaneous and other modes of interpreting, and basically started saying, well, this is something we should be doing in Canada. That we looked to what was happening elsewhere and we realized that there was a need to be met. So that led, in fact, before the Official Languages Act in 1969, a salient date in Canadian history was in 1959, when simultaneous interpreting was provided in the House of Commons for the first time. The Senate, the second legislative chamber in our parliament, followed suit shortly thereafter. There were procurement issues. It took them 2 years to get equipment brought over from Great Britain, but basically it was the change from symbolic bilingualism and symbolic equality to pragmatic or practically allowing or enabling members of parliament to rise and speak in French and be understood by English Canada. So it was a real change from symbolic to pragmatic, and I think your question sort of touched on that. And in Canada, that continues. I get a headache when I think about 24 languages. We have enough challenges providing simultaneous interpreting in 2 languages. We have 2 legislative chambers. We have, at any given moment, any given day when the House is sitting and the Senate is sitting, we have up to 30 parliamentary committees who are sitting. So we have a team of interpreters who are literally racing across Parliament Hill. And that's just on Parliament, because we also serve the whole of government. So currently I have 2 teams. One is serving Parliament and one is serving government, but one of the things we're doing right now is looking at pooling them together, because it is such a challenge covering the time slides and the number, like you said, 10,000 interpreter days. So for us, it's in 1969 was when also the equality was given to French and English much more practically. They were given official language status, and the government had to be able to communicate with Canadians in both official languages. And 2019 is the 50th anniversary of our Official Languages Act, and so over the years it's been modernized, and this year it's undergoing another modernization process. Currently, official languages legislation is more than just providing services to Canadians in French and English. It's also about promoting the vitality of the minority language communities, so that would be English-speaking communities in Quebec and French-speaking communities outside of Quebec. And now in 2019, modernization is looking at how languages are changing and communication is changing in the digital era. So that's a whole separate chapter that's about to start in Canada. And also 2019 for us is another big year, because this year the Canadian government enacted Indigenous languages legislation. So Indigenous languages have been recognized with a special status, not official status. And this is stemming from, I would say, a long and arduous and difficult reconciliation process in Canada. So we are seeing now that we had a parliamentary committee that said that we would now be providing services for members of parliament who wish to rise and speak in the House of Commons in an Indigenous language. So as you can imagine, I've been very busy with my team trying to figure out how to meet that need, that capacity. Just this year, we provided interpreting in the House, on the chamber of the House of Commons, in Plains Cree, Eastern Cree, Inuktitut, Dene, Mohawk. That's it, yeah.
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 That's quite a bit as it stands.
Yeah. So for us, while it may not seem we don't have 24 languages, but there's 100 Indigenous languages in Canada. So we're in the process of elections right now. So as of October 22nd, we will have new members of parliament, and I may have to meet language needs that we don't even know about capacity and resources. So.
Yeah. It's fascinating. And I'm going to resist the temptation to look forward and say, oh, what does that mean and how are you going to approach it? Because we're focusing on the last 100 years. And so we'll rewind a little bit, and I think we should go to 1953, which is a pretty important year in the profession of conference interpreting, which is when UNIGE was officially founded. And so we have seen how within the European Union, within the United Nations, within the League of Nations and the ILO, how interpreting came into being. But of course, behind the whole process of providing interpretation and making it so people can speak in multiple languages, you have the whole issue of who's going to be doing that and how are they going to be doing that. And if I can take just quickly a page from one of Jesus's books where he referred to interpreting transitioning from being seen as an amazing feat or magic to a profession. And UNIGE had a lot to do with that. So 1953, how did it all start and how did we get to where we are today?
I can't remember. Yes, definitely. What you say is true. To come back for a second to your initial question of why are we so interested in our history, and why should we be so interested in our history? I think the instinctive answer is because our history is our identity. As interpreters, we have a bit of an identity crisis because we're always supposed to be in the background, never in the forefront. We're bound to secrecy, so there's not much storytelling that goes around. So I think all of us who get involved in this profession become very curious about who are we, where do we come from, who were the people who started all of this. And interestingly enough, what I discovered in doing just that was that back in 1953, which you just mentioned, it was chief interpreters who were the main instigators of founding UNIGE, because they said, look, we have similar interests, we need to explain somehow to the powers that be in our organizations that we can't just work like that. We need rules. We need to know on what terms we hire interpreters, what defines a professional interpreter, etc., etc. So that's one of those things. Another thing which is very interesting in terms of our history, which I also find, is that we're revisiting the same issues time and again. If you browse through the archives of UNIGE back at our office and look at the old bulletins and letters from the president, the same things come up all the time. A report on how they're struggling in negotiations with this or that organization, a report from 1983 on how remote interpretation tests went, and the first guidelines on remote interpreting, including also the first standards on sound and image quality, believe it or not. So all those things keep on repeating themselves time and again, which is I think something very fascinating, and it brings us back to the question of why do we have this organization called UNIGE? Why join this organization called UNIGE? And it's, in fact, a perennial question that has as many answers as questions.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's interesting to note, you noted that in the last few years, we've seen the membership of UNIGE go up by about 1,000, which is, I mean, that's a 50% increase. And there's also been a significant expansion of interpreting, and I think an awareness, particularly with what's happened in the last decade with social media. The connectedness of practitioners, I think, is at a higher level than it has ever been. And there are a lot of folks that are watching and seeing how things are done, and that is informing practice in countries and language combinations that often here in Europe, we don't really think about. Right? Because of what we're focused on and the kind of work that we may be doing in the States. But there is a lot of interpreting going on in many different areas and many different venues. And so I think that we're going to see more of a desire to be associated with other colleagues, with other professionals, to be able to have something to lean on, right? So that they don't have to reinvent the wheel. But thank you for that. Let's go back for just a minute, and I'd like to talk a little bit more about the importance of the Nuremberg trials and what went on there. As I have looked at history and thought about what is it that drives interpreting, I've come up with a nice little way to explain this, and I think it covers things pretty well. I'll be interested to hear from folks in the audience and also from you if you think that there may be something that's left out. But I think when we talk about the drivers of interpreting, you have the 3 C's. Traditionally, that was conquest, conversion, and commerce. I think in today's modern world, conquest gratefully has been left a little bit behind, and we see that that's not a way to approach things. However, conflict does continue to pop up much more than I think any of us would like. And so those 3 C's are what drive the need for interaction. We see this in conflicts that are taking place all over the world, and the refugees that produces, the need for sides that are not in agreement to actually be able to communicate with one another, giving rise to the kind of interpreting that's been going on in conflict zones for some time. With conversion, well, with the many faith traditions and religions of the world, much of what has propelled the kind of the translation and interpreting work of the last 100 years has been often driven by this desire to spread the word about one's beliefs. And commerce, well, I think that's much of where we are today. And I think if I were to ask Juan Carlos, what are many of the meetings about that take place at the European Commission, they're going to have a lot to do with who is going to sell what to whom and what kind of regulations have to be met in order to do that. And so as we look at these, and we then look at the Nuremberg trials, that it was the result of conflict and trying to resolve what took place and come to grips with what took place. We have this desire to have justice be met and in a speedy fashion. And with that, that was really what they had. And so Jesus, again, I'm going to look back to you, one as the historian here of the group. What did that mean for the interpreters that were eventually recruited? If my memory serves me, some of the interpreters that worked at the trials were actually from refugee camps that were a result of the Second World War. And I think, again, going back to understanding history, that has a lot to do with some of the situations that we may be even seeing in the world today and the needs for interpreting, and often multilingual people come from different circumstances. You know, what was it like for these interpreters to come in and be asked to do something that hadn't been done before, really, in any length, and that there wasn't necessarily training available for?
Me parece que voy a regresar a la sabia fórmula seguida por mi compañero
Perfecto.
Juan Carlos. Lo siento por quienes no siguen español directo, pero así damos trabajo también a la cabina inglesa. Me voy a referir a Doster, que fue el que de alguna forma coordinó la interpretación simultánea en Nuremberg, señalando que él, que procedía de un lugar del norte de Francia que fue primero barrido por los alemanes en la Primera Guerra Mundial, y él tuvo que estudiar alemán siendo pequeño y demás, y después fue reconquistado por las tropas estadounidenses de los aliados, que es algo que se está haciendo en estos momentos en muchos conflictos del mundo, donde hay intérpretes locales que actúan para las tropas que están interviniendo en el lugar. Curiosamente, no había terminado la secundaria y un soldado estadounidense se lo llevó a California, donde acabó la secundaria y donde luego estudió su carrera, y después llegaría a ser profesor catedrático en Georgetown. Quiero decir, el conflicto de entonces generó una actitud de benevolencia de los estadounidenses, de las tropas estadounidenses, que se llevaron a uno de sus intérpretes de vuelta para los Estados Unidos, y eso fue después fundamental para su formación, que una formación que se había curtido, diríamos, iba a decir en las trincheras, no en las trincheras porque él no estaba en la guerra, fue una zona ocupada, pero él no participó como tal en la guerra porque era muy pequeño. Él nació en el año 4, si no recuerdo mal, en 1904. Pero quiero decir, él ya procedía de ese ámbito. Y cuando decías tú antes algo respecto a cómo él vio el reto de hacer justicia de una manera rápida, en realidad era un hombre al que se puede considerar, a lo mejor te suena, tech savvy. A lo mejor te suena algo, Barry. Es decir, era una persona inclinada a los avances tecnológicos y por eso él creyó en el experimento que se había hecho anteriormente y creyó que se podía aplicar también en Nuremberg una vez que ya existía la patente de IBM y demás. Es más, Doster estuvo poco tiempo en las Naciones Unidas por el conflicto que hubo entre los consecutivistas y los simultáneos y de ahí se marchó a Georgetown. Pero en Georgetown lo que hizo fue enseñar, por un lado, pero intentar también experiencias de traducción automática con IBM. En el año 1951 empezó, en plena Guerra Fría, empezó a hacer experimentos con un algoritmo de 300 palabras en ruso y en inglés. En el año 1951. Entonces, no se decía, como se podría decir hoy, yo personalmente es algo que lanzo así como una cuestión, lo de la idea de cry wolf, que viene el lobo. Bueno, pues yo creo que ahora lo que vamos a tener que decir es que viene el algoritmo, porque realmente es el algoritmo el que nos tiene controlados, los algoritmos de todas las empresas que nos vigilan realmente, que son nuestro verdadero hermano mayor, orwelliano, que nos vigila, pues yo creo que habría que ir por ahí. Entonces, que trajera gente de distintos lugares, sí. Los soviéticos vinieron con su equipo a Nuremberg. Los franceses reclutaron donde pudieron. De ahí, entre otras cosas, viene lo del telefoniste, precisamente porque en algunos de los sitios donde reclutaban eran en las centrales telefónicas donde hacían intercambio con lenguas, sobre todo con dos lenguas, con inglés y con francés. También durante la guerra, el tiempo que se quedaron los estadounidenses, tenían sus intérpretes franceses o francesas, eran sobre todo mujeres en ese caso, que hacían la doble labor. Y en otros casos, pues encontraron donde pudieron. Desde luego en Ginebra, o gente que había estudiado en Ginebra, fue para allá. Algunos habían practicado mínimamente la simultánea, como Roriti y como Chevalier. Habían hecho algo de simultánea antes, pero la mayoría no. La mayoría realmente cayeron allí. Un poco como paracaidistas, para trabajar. Creo que me he ido por las ramas, pero en cualquier caso...
Está bien, podemos regresar al tronco.
Va por ahí.
Perfecto, gracias. Bueno, we've only got about 15 minutes left, and there's one other topic that I definitely want to get to as we think about the milestones in the last 100 years. 1919, the 1920s, and what took place here at the ILO. Then you go to the Nuremberg trials in the 1940s, the establishment of UNIGE, the creation of official language legislation for a number of countries that are officially, multilingual or bilingual. But I'm going to go into that realm of tech savviness that you referred to quickly here, and I want to read a couple of quotes that actually come from the 1920s. And these are direct quotes from the archives of the ILO, from interpreters who were opining on the introduction of this newfangled system that Filene had supported and provided the funding for and pushed to be used at the institutions of the League of Nations. Here's one. My feeling was against the Filene system as compared to the present one. Its disadvantages seem to me a good deal greater than its obvious advantages. Then there's another one. I should be glad to have your instructions with regard to interpreters. Most of the League interpreters are, I think, rather opposed to the system, and in any case, none of them has had any opportunity of practicing it. I found it interesting that they were opposed to something they'd never tried before. But nevertheless, that was the situation. Now, these two quotes, I bring these up because, Juan Carlos, I'm going to turn the time over to you again to refer to what some have called the Big Bang of remote interpreting that happened. Now, surely there have been other tests and other things, but there are events that put certain processes into motion. And although there had been other remote interpreting tests in the UN previously, the event that happened in, I've got to find my notes here, in 2005, when we had the British EU Presidency Summit at Hampton Court that led to remote interpreting. Tell us a little bit about that and how that meeting in 2005 has had an influence on interpreting practice since that time.
Pues sí, con vuestro permiso, quisiera recalcar que aunque represento a las instituciones europeas en su conjunto aquí, yo trabajo en el Parlamento Europeo y no podré, por tanto, ocultar que antes de Hampton Court hubo un evento previo en el Parlamento Europeo. Y
Díganos más.
pasaré a Hampton Court después, pero quisiera empezar con el primer momento en que verdaderamente en las instituciones europeas se produjo una situación en la que tuvimos que recurrir a la interpretación a distancia. Y esto fue que justo antes del 2004, cuando se produjo lo que llamamos el Big Bang, con la llegada de nada menos que 10 países miembros de forma simultánea a la Unión Europea, el entonces presidente del Parlamento Europeo, que era un irlandés que se llamaba Pat Cox, tuvo la genial idea de invitar a representantes de los futuros Estados miembros a una sesión parlamentaria en Estrasburgo. Por supuesto, como todavía no se había producido la adhesión, nuestros colegas técnicos y arquitectos estaban todavía en plena faena de construir las cabinas adicionales que necesitaríamos a partir de mayo del 2004. Pero esto fue en noviembre del 2003. Con lo cual, por primera vez se dijo, bueno, hay que traer a intérpretes de todas estas lenguas, hay que ponerles en algún sitio. En el hemiciclo no hay cabinas, las cabinas estaban todavía construyendo. Vamos a probar esta cosa misteriosa, pero que seguro que funciona, que es la interpretación a distancia. Vamos a poner a los intérpretes en otra sala y hacemos el pleno con todas las lenguas oficiales a partir del 2004. Con lo cual, ¿qué ocurrió? Pues que, por supuesto, los intérpretes que íbamos a estar en el hemiciclo, porque pertenecíamos a las lenguas que ya eran oficiales, nos unimos en plena solidaridad con nuestros colegas que iban a estar en situación de teleinterpretación y dijimos que no podía haber esa diferencia entre unos y otros. Y más o menos, digamos que amenazamos con no interpretar durante esa sesión solemne. Y en ese momento, efectivamente, el entonces secretario general del Parlamento Europeo, Julian Priestley, dijo: hagamos la interpretación y prometo que inmediatamente después vamos a iniciar unos estudios para conocer los posibles efectos de la teleinterpretación y habrá una negociación para tener un acuerdo para regular ese tipo de trabajo en el futuro. Y efectivamente, en 2004, después de interpretar en esa sesión solemne, se iniciaron unos estudios, vino una empresa externa que durante, creo, si recuerdo bien, durante 2 semanas estuvo siguiendo desde un punto de vista médico a 2 equipos de intérpretes que trabajaban en reuniones reales y había 2 equipos, en vez de uno, había 2 equipos de intérpretes completos. Unos que trabajaban en situación, entre comillas, habitual, en cabinas dentro de la sala, y otro equipo que estaba en exactamente la misma reunión, pero trabajando en modo de teleinterpretación. Y esta empresa o esta sociedad externa llevaba, evidentemente, hacía mediciones de tipo médico, porque me acuerdo que los intérpretes estaban constantemente enchufados a todo tipo de máquinas para medir pues, la presión sanguínea, el factor de estrés, si les subía la tensión, si les bajaba otra cosa, en fin, no sé qué mediciones hicieron. Y en base a eso se estableció que efectivamente trabajar en situación de teleinterpretación aumentaba la situación de estrés de los intérpretes. Nadie sabemos si es verdaderamente por estar trabajando en teleinterpretación o si simplemente pues porque estaban trabajando de una forma en la que no estaban acostumbrados a trabajar. Eso no se sabe, pero en cualquier caso eso fue el inicio para que se iniciaran unas negociaciones que en un primer momento, con AIC, por cierto, que en un primer momento se iban a iniciar de forma monoinstitucional, pero justo en ese momento ocurrió Hampton Court, que fue la cumbre del Consejo con una presidencia entonces del Reino Unido, quién lo diría en los tiempos que corren, pero efectivamente el Reino Unido ostentaba la presidencia de la Unión Europea en aquel momento. Quisieron organizar una cumbre en un lugar maravilloso e histórico como es Hampton Court y, como ocurre en muchas ocasiones, creo que todos los que somos intérpretes habremos vivido esas situaciones, nadie quiere afear una sala maravillosa, histórica, llena de cuadros, llena de todo tipo de cosas maravillosas, con unas cabinas móviles, grises, feas y tal. Entonces, pues evidentemente dijeron, nos negamos a poner cabinas en la sala donde se reunía el Consejo y efectivamente instalaron cabinas fuera y entonces también tuvieron que recurrir a la teleinterpretación, lo cual dio entonces lugar a que se negociara ya las tres instituciones europeas, es decir, la Comisión Europea, el Parlamento Europeo y el Tribunal de Justicia, que están todos representados aquí hoy. Se lanzaron esas negociaciones con AIC que desembocaron en un acuerdo que firmamos en 2006 y que sigue en vigor hoy, aunque haya habido algunas pequeñas modificaciones posteriormente.
Muy bien, muchas gracias por esa explicación. Y voy a cambiar otra vez al inglés, nada más para avisar a los intérpretes. We've got about 10 minutes left, and I have a couple of questions that I'd like the panelists to reflect on, and Uros and Matthew, I'm going to look to you first with these, but let me preface the question with a quote. Again, this is a quote that I pulled from some of Jesus's work, quoting a New York Times article from April 24th, 1974. This was an article that was written during the strike at the UN at the headquarters in New York in 1974. And the concern of the interpreters is encapsulated, I think, in this short quote from one of them. And I think it refers to the motivation, I think, of a lot of our resistance sometimes to change and new ways of doing things. They said, we have become completely anonymous, non-beings, just voices. And I think that speaks to the human element of interpreting, and one of the reasons that it has been such an attractive thing for those of us who work in the profession, because it's that opportunity to facilitate communication between people and to feel that connection and to help that connection be there. And so this idea of being completely anonymous, non-beings, just voices, is a scary thing. And yet here we are with so many new ways that people are communicating, the way that they're meeting today. And the question I have is, what do you think we've done wrong over the last 100 years? And what could we do better as a profession? I know these are hard questions. It looks like you've got something to say, Uros, so please dive right in.
I do. In fact, your question shows that what we're facing all the time is history repeating.
Yeah.
over and over again. I mean, the last bout of industrial action we had at the European Parliament not long ago was, I think, to a large extent the result of the same fear, the fear of alienation, the fear of people becoming pure numbers, of having to just respond to productivity demands, etc., etc. That's how things were perceived among the interpreter public, to my understanding, and I wouldn't say. I don't think we did anything wrong over the past 100 years. As I said earlier today in my introductory remarks, I think we're victims of our own success. Interpretation has proven so useful, so good if done right. You know, coming back to the old Seleskovich maxim of mediocre interpretation is not necessary. It either has to be professional and high quality or don't have it. So I think we've done everything right, and that's one of our problems in a certain way. Interpretation has expanded to such levels, especially in places like the European Parliament and the UN, that you now actually need professional managers to run those services. It's not enough to have a talented interpreter who turns manager over time. So that's one answer to your question. If I may, just for a minute, come back to what you mentioned earlier about remote or distance interpreting or whatever you want to call it. The sentence you mentioned from the ILO in between the two wars, never tried it, but it has to be bad. Mm-hmm. You know, new technologies. That's very much how things were at least perceived at the onset of this new phenomenon, which has been around now for a couple of years. And we in UNIGE have been trying very hard to give people a chance to try and use this technology, to see what it's all about. And over the past 2 years, there hasn't been a meeting called by UNIGE in the regions or in the sectors or whatever, where RSI, remote simultaneous interpreting, wouldn't have been on the agenda, and people were given a chance to try it, and there's a lot more acceptance all of a sudden, because they were able to see what it's about and see how it works. And remote, I think actually 2005 is not maybe the year where everything changed. Everyone's done remote. Every time you do TV interpretation, it's remote in one way or another. And I think also the Hampton Court style remote interpreting today is remote soft. It's accepted, people do it. It's not a biggie anymore. Okay, nobody wants to do it every day because it's way too tiring, but it's acceptable. What's entirely new now, and this brings us back to this notion of alienation, is that online platforms could potentially lead to, this is the black scenario, of one half of the team sitting at a kitchen table in Los Angeles, your partner sitting in his living room in New York, working for a client in Japan, and being paid by somebody from Brussels. I don't know. That's sort of the dark scenario, which I very much doubt is going to materialize anytime soon. But I think one of the main things that interpreters fear is this notion of alienation. Yeah. So some sort of closeness, some sort of proximity, some sort of feeling of belonging has to be there if you want the interpreter to be your partner, which is something we spoke about today.
Yeah, I think that's a great takeaway. Matthew, do you want to tackle that question too?
I think, like Uros, I would maybe take umbrage with the assumption in your question, which is what have we done wrong? I think we've done a lot right, and I think like any profession and any field, we evolve with time, and I think that you know, when we heard the presentations earlier and saw the photos from Jesus's presentation, I turned to my colleague and I said, this is the same things we're experiencing now. So, and to return to your original question at the outset, which is, why do we need to know our past? It is because we're seeing the same things, and it's just things evolve over time. We've seen versions of remote interpreting over time. I mean, simultaneous interpretation is in some sense the beginning of remote interpreting, where people were sitting in the booths and not next to their client.
Yeah, the first time that it got moved away, right? That was the first step.
And I think also one of the things that it's important for us as interpreters to remember is that, and I think what it explains, because I've seen this among my team, interpreters are passionate about what they do. They want to serve their clients. They're there to bridge. They're there to serve as a communication bridge between cultures and languages. And the tension, the resistance you're feeling is about that, because unless we know we can do it well, we will be resistant to it. And I think, for example, I know some of the cases in my team, we've experienced some problems and some challenges. There are not, the technology maybe isn't well established enough to provide it, and so one of the things we're trying to do is make sure the conditions and the technology is in place so that our interpreters can provide the service they want to provide. And if we give them those conditions, they will be perfectly happy. I also think that we're seeing a newer generation of interpreters, people younger than those of us up here, and they're used to working and having an easier interaction with technology. It's much easier these days to be in touch with people and to communicate with people across time zones across the world. I've had some excellent, interactions with people who are not necessarily there. So we know it's possible with technology to do things well. We also know that it's valuable and important to meet in person, such as we're doing here today. And it's nice for me to meet people whom I've known professionally, but only through emails. And it's nice to talk to people and see people. So the future will hold a variety of these things. And to me, the technology, and I know I'm not supposed to talk about the future, but to me, the past, if I'm going to speak to your initial question, there's lots to learn about from the past because it will affect our future and it will come back, the same things. And so we haven't done things wrong. We just need to look at our past to see how we made things right when we face challenges, because we faced all these challenges in the past.
Great. Just want to give Juan Carlos or Jesus, if you have any last comments as we wrap up regarding that question. Perhaps I should rephrase it a little bit and say, what might we have done differently?
A mí normalmente me gusta hacer autocrítica, pero hoy no voy a hacer mucha. Yo creo que no voy a hablar tanto de lo que podemos o no podemos haber hecho mal en el pasado, pero sí que creo que tenemos que aprender de la historia, de ahí la importancia de ser consciente de la historia para no cometer errores en el futuro. Tenemos que aprender de nuestra historia. Nuestra profesión ha evolucionado mucho en los últimos 100 o 1000 años, no sé cuántos, pero bueno, hemos estado mirando a los últimos 100. La profesión ha evolucionado muchísimo. De trabajar como hemos visto hoy a principios del siglo XX, a pasar a trabajar de consecutiva simultánea, y la profesión va a seguir evolucionando. Entonces, no sé si hemos cometido muchos errores en el pasado, yo creo que no, pero creo que cometeríamos un grave error ahora si nos negáramos a seguir evolucionando como hemos evolucionado en los últimos 100 años. Y tenemos que evolucionar.
Perfecto, muy bien. Jesús.
Pues estoy de acuerdo con mis compañeros que efectivamente no se puede reescribir la historia, lo que se ha hecho y la evolución de la profesión ha sido pues la normal de cualquier profesión, con altibajos, con problemas superados o no, y también estoy completamente de acuerdo con lo último que acaba de decir Juan Carlos. Me parece que así termino yo quizá el libro sobre los intérpretes en las Naciones Unidas, que si de algo han dado muestras a lo largo de la historia los intérpretes es de su capacidad de adaptarse a las circunstancias. Y entonces yo creo que una prueba clarísima es la evolución que ha habido con la incorporación de las tecnologías de la información. No me refiero solo al peligro así de la remota, que se considera como no sé, como algo negativo, así en principio y demás, sino a la vertiente positiva de lo que ha significado eso para poderse formar, para tener en un pendrive todos los documentos, para tener un ordenador o en fin, cualquier equipamiento en cabina que te sirva para mejorar tu prestación. En fin, yo creo que eso se va evolucionando conforme pasa el tiempo. Y además, lo que yo decía antes de pensar generacional, que cada generación lo piense, y lo decía también Uros ahora, que hay mucha gente joven, y también Matthew, que hay mucha gente más joven que está llegando y que, bueno, no sé, yo no sé si se puede hablar ya ni siquiera de interfaz o interface, sino más bien de interpantalla, porque es que realmente se nace delante de una pantalla ya prácticamente. Entonces no sé hasta qué punto la pantalla para los jóvenes no significa pues algo mucho menos duro que para la gente del pasado. Yo recuerdo una compañera que dimitió cuando le obligaban a utilizar ordenador. Dice que ya con su mentalidad no iba, en fin, es así.
Yeah, that is definitely the case. So I think just to try and pull the essence out of this discussion that we've had over the last hour, I think we can say that adaptation, evolution, and innovation are key points of the profession over the last 100 years, adapting to the needs that were there to be able to provide the service. And I think that there is much to be said at the core of what has happened in our profession that has to do with that human element, the connection and the ability to be able to bring people together, to be that bridge. And whatever the future may bring, if we are able to maintain that and to feel connected to those that we work with, I think that we'll have that sense of satisfaction that, frankly, I think brings a lot of us into the profession. And so it really is remembering that we are not just voices. We are not completely anonymous. We are part of the interaction and a very important part of it. And if we are able to maintain that, we can adapt and evolve for the future. So I want to thank each of you for being on the panel and for your insights. For me, it has been an honor and a true privilege to be able to share the stage with you, and I hope that you have all enjoyed hearing from these wonderful gentlemen. Thank you for your time.